Okay. Good afternoon. Everybody had enough coffee to make their way through the rest of the balance of the day. So what I want to talk to you today about is an interesting chapter that takes place in the annals of any company that seeks to be innovative. And that's the fact that you can rest upon your innovation laurels for about 18 months or 24 months, and very quickly your clients are saying, well, that was great, and we'll keep using that, and what else have you got? And so what I want to tell you about today, some of you are probably not yet familiar with the tool called Mindsight, which began about 3 years ago as an applied neuroscience technique for eliciting and explaining motivation. What moves people to make various choices, what moves people to be connected to certain brands instead of other ones, what moves them to choose certain lifestyles instead of other lifestyles. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about the basic tool, but then I'm going to tell you about, if you will, the son of Mindsight, or maybe the daughter. That is a new tool that we've created on the strength of the basic science behind the Mindsight tool that goes after a very different kind of emotion, which doesn't have to do with motivation. And I'm going to tell you about the difference between these two kinds of emotion and why it's important to know about both. So everyone knows, I'm sure, that emotions are pretty critical to effective marketing. I think in the last 15 years or 20 years, people have gone to recognize that having people feel in a positive way about your product is at least as important, if not more important, than having them think in positive ways about your product. And in fact, in the academy, in the academic world of psychology, I think it's also the case that the recognition of the importance in emotional motivation in determining what people do has been on the rise, and there have been a host of studies done in which oftentimes it looks as if how people feel has a better chance of explaining what they do next than what they're thinking. And oftentimes, in fact, those emotions are also kind of below the level of consciousness, so you're doing things for reasons that you aren't even always completely aware of. Anyone who's ever done any market research knows that it's not super easy to get people to tell you about their feelings. You know, when there are a couple of big reasons that we call the won't say and the can't say reasons, a very big reason, and depending upon the kind of respondents, it's bigger or smaller, but the fact is that emotions are often not grown up. You know, emotions can be childish, emotions can be selfish, emotions can be impulsive. And revealing your emotional states or talking in an open, candid way about how you're feeling about a topic or about how your feelings influence your behavior won't always cast respondents in a fabulous light to this person who they've just met a few minutes before who's a market research interviewer. And so there are things that people won't say. But there are also things that people can't say. And they can't say those things because the seat of emotion, it doesn't lay right on top of the centers of speech, and there's a lot that goes on emotionally in the brain, which is sort of below the threshold of consciousness, and even the cooperative respondent, who doesn't mind talking to you about the feelings they have, can't always tell you everything you're seeking to know. So it's not an easy task. So about 5 years ago, I'm a big reader of neuroscience. I'm not a neuroscientist, but I like the work, and I think it's an interesting direction that we're taking as psychologists. And one of the things you find when you read this work is a bunch of studies that all focus on what goes on in the brain when you show people pictures. And the reason this work is done, I think, is because what goes on when you show people pictures is in some ways a surrogate for what goes on when people see something new in their lives. And the data are pretty consistent that what happens is in a very short period of time, very, very tiny fraction of a second, maybe 100 milliseconds or 150 milliseconds, the individual recognizes the content of the picture. Oh, it's a dog. You know, it's a picture of a tree, what have you. And then, for about a full half second, or maybe even a little longer than that, I'm not going to step off the stage, you have a reaction which is focused almost exclusively in what's called the limbic system of the brain. And those of you who are you know, even sort of amateur neuroanatomists know that that's the space, it's the hippocampus and the hypothalamus and the amygdala, and there are all these little structures of the brain that have to do with emotions. So the thought upon reading this, and the wellspring for the beginning of Mindsight, was wouldn't it be fantastic if we could design a task that got responses from people in this, what I call the emotional discovery window, which is a period of time that's well short of 1 second, during which most of the neural activity that's been documented by my friends, the neuroscientists, is in the emotional centers of the brain. So you'd be able, if you could do that, to get responses which weren't mediated by a whole lot of editing and evaluation and self-presentational screens and all of those things that get in the way with the won't say that I was telling you about before, and you potentially get things that are below the threshold of consciousness so that you're getting things that can be sort of reported out, if you will, by pre-consciousness, by the limbic system. So how do you do that? The first thing is you have to know what the pictures mean when you show them to the individuals, because you can't spend any time with the respondents asking them what they think they see, or there's no dialogue possible in a time frame like this when you're looking to understand people's emotions. And so you have to establish what the pictures mean ahead of time. So it so happened that kind of concurrently, and frankly not intentionally, and I think a lot of innovation happens this way, I had been developing and systematizing a model for human motivation that kind of rolled up the various theorists that have been running around for the last 100 years talking about motivation. And the thing about those psychologists is they tended always to have one particular kind of hobby horse that they were interested in. So Maslow was interested exclusively in how do you actualize yourself and come to feel that. And McClelland is another famous fellow who studied achievement. And there are people who studied nurturance and so on. But no one sort of said, well, what's the whole thing look like then? So what is the list of, and people had lists in some cases, but there was never a structure for deciding, well, how many are there and how would we know if we had enough of them? And so what you see here is my humble attempt to put together what's really a periodic table of motivation. For those of you that are theory geeks, we can take it offline and I can tell you about how the columns and the rows organize these motives. I didn't invent any new motives, by the way. There have been plenty of people working on motivation, but you'll see security and empowerment and mastery and achievement and words you all recognize. The insight here, the progress here, was developing a matrix in which the columns and the rows organize these motives in a way that, you know, we can talk outside afterwards. I'm not going to spend on them, but you could go, okay, yeah, I guess that makes sense. That's all there are. That's all there needs to be. So with this, then, you have a foundation to develop an image library whose meanings you will know ahead of time, but which also is a comprehensive image library for measuring, in this case, motivation. And we have this image library, which allows us then, and I can talk about validation offline with people as well. I know we're short on time. You then prime a subject by giving them what we call a priming sentence. We tell the subject, okay, this is going to be a sentence completion task. But instead of using words to complete the sentences, you're going to pick pictures out. So you give the subject the sentence, I would be excited to wear this fragrance because it might make me feel a little more, and then the instruction is, you'll complete your sentence by picking images. I'm going to show you these images very rapidly, and you'll typically, you know, in an online survey, we'll give them a small practice round. In a qualitative setting, you'll make an illustration, but you need to be able to see how rapidly it goes. And then the respondent is instructed to pick as many pictures as they see that give them a feeling which completes their sentence. And so that's the motivational tool, all right? And it's pretty interesting in its own right, but that's actually not what I'm here to talk about. Related to that, though, is another kind of emotion, because the tool I was just telling you about is all about uncovering and understanding emotional motivations. And emotional motivations, if you will, they're almost intrinsic. You walk around in life, you have a certain kind of emotional DNA that probably has to do with all kinds of things that happened to you when you were this big and so on. But then you build up aspirations in life as well as frustrations, and those give rise to emotions which can become motivations. But then you do things and you make choices and you have experiences and you perceive them and you sense them. And then there's another whole set of emotions that are the kind that you get in as a reaction to what's going on around you. So a completely different class of emotions that we call sensory emotional experiences, which is different from emotional motivation. And in the attempt to continuously raise the bar on our innovation in the Mindsight space, we have now developed a tool, I think a very interesting tool, to look at sensory emotional experience. So how are these different? I've given you some sense of what motivation motivating emotions are like, but experiential emotions, as I said, they're evoked by the environment. If motivating emotions are almost traits, so you're an achievement-oriented guy and you're looking for places and opportunities to achieve, and you're kind of carrying this around with you as a latent drive, experiential emotions are more like states. So you walk into a room and it feels calm, or you get engaged, or you get nervous, or what have you. A bottom line, motivational emotions have to do with why we buy things, but sensory emotional experiences help you understand how products feel, how choices feel, what it feels like to drive in this car, or wear that piece of clothing, or don this fragrance, or put on those shoes, or buy this book as opposed to that one. And so research in the space of experiential emotions has become an important part of our offering at Mindsight, because it's often the case that you may well want to understand what are the emotional drivers of behavior, what are the emotions that motivate people, but then in order to communicate with people about how their life feels, or how your product might feel in their lives, you need to understand something about sensory emotions. Now, here's where it gets kind of interesting. In the motivational space, there's a lot of theory, a lot of background, and a lot of stuff to work with. And I'd already made, in fact, before we invented the Mindsight tool, this progress on the model that I shared with you earlier. In the sensory emotional space, there's all those emotion words you've ever seen in whichever language you speak, as well as whatever others you're a master of. And in fact, there are a tremendous number of sources of people who will provide you with lists of different emotions, and they'll typically number into the hundreds. So we decided to take a totally different approach to understanding sensory emotional experience. And that is, we collected a set of thousands of emotionally evocative images. We took a whole bunch of interns and we gave them a bunch of emotion words from half a dozen different lists that you can find online of people who've studied emotion. There's an enormous range of ideas, but we just wanted a lot of pictures, because then we make this into a big data exercise. If the Mindsight motivational profiling tool is all about having 9 base categories that you know the motivation is in, and profiling, okay, here's the score in the mastery column, and here's the score in the engagement column, and this has to do with how people feel about this car brand versus that brand, or this is how people want to feel more of when they're putting their dinner on the table. It really is crowdsourcing. Our crowds aren't quite as big as some, but we do to discover themes in emotionality and sensory emotional experience, kind of what the folks at Amazon do when they tell you that, if you read this book, people who read this also read that. So it's that kind of and it's, in fact, there's some Dutch mathematics guys that do some very interesting math that helps us do this. But the technique now is to take literally hundreds of respondents unto thousands and hundreds unto thousands of images. Now, the stimulus sentence becomes a little different. When I'm drinking Dos Equis, it makes that moment feel, so it's a setup for a sensory emotional answer, and you plot hundreds of pictures, and then with this math, you're able to say, okay, what kind of themes do we get in there? What clumps are there? The pictures are mapped, and again, I won't bore you with the math. We can talk about that later if you like, but is an enormous space which represents the way that you first pictured the data, and then the analysis is able to go in and say, here's this cluster here, here's a kind of a gravity well, a bunch of stuff here, and here's some more here, and you'll end up with 5 or 6 or 7 themes in the sensory emotional experience of any given target lifestyle moment or brand experience or what have you. And what I want to close with are just some sample outputs from this. Advertising agencies go crazy for this, okay? Because this is the kind of thing that becomes a creative stimulus of the kind that they're off to the races. What's also intriguing about it, and clients love about it too, is what you get back in the first order of deliverable is a cluster of images, which form somewhat of a gestalt. We've put names on some of these, and our clients usually collaborate to put names on them, but it's a wordless enterprise. And so initially, the concepts are literally the sum of the images that come out from the analysis. And so let's just look at a few of these. Here's some images that formed a theme. That was a study we were doing on home cleaning that had to do with how you feel when you've gotten things under control. Again, this was one of about half a dozen images that we produced for this client in that study. Very intriguing. When we first got this, we were like, what is that? What is that about? This was consumers in China telling us what it feels like to have good air in your home. And in our deliverable to the client, in fact, we had our Chinese consultant draw a character, which turns out to be translated roughly as peaceful path into English. An interesting image from right here in Brazil. It was a personal care study, and this is one of the emotional themes that respondents gave us when they talked about finishing a regimen of personal care. Interestingly, in this study, which was a global study, and they're all unique, so if you do 6 countries, you might get different themes in every country. Almost the same theme emerged in one only other place, which was Italy. So maybe your brother's under the soil in some way, I don't know. This was, I've got my little cheat sheet here. This was an emotional theme that came up when we were talking about laundry care with clients, on behalf of clients where we went to Germany and talked to respondents there. How do you really want to feel when your laundry's done just right? This was, in Spain, an emotion connected to physical fitness. This was a US emotional theme that had to do with a particular kind of perfume and the prospect of wearing it. This was a clothing line and an emotion connected to it amongst British respondents. Another emotional theme, this time from Russia, again connected to a perfume. So, look at that. I guess I'm out of time too. Good. That's basically the tool. The Mindsight emotional discovery tool now has 2 manifestations. There's the motivational tool, and now we have the sensory emotional tool. And there are numbers of engagements, in fact, which we're using both now. And we're having a lot of fun in this space. Questions? Yes?
Just a quick question about the cultural differences between Latin culture, Anglo-Saxon culture, Middle East culture,
Yes.
Eastern culture. I don't know. There should be a difference.
No, that's fair. The motivational tool has now been separately validated in several regions. We validated, in fact, one of my colleagues who's here helped me. We validated it in Brazil. We have validated it in India and in China and in Western Europe. And actually, it's a little different in Canada than the US. So those are separate. The image libraries are considerably overlapping, but in fact, it's been validated separately. The emotion library, it's massive numbers of emotions, and so some of them don't pop in some of the countries, but it's not a validation exercise because the concepts themselves are crowdsourced in each study, in each culture. Okay. Other questions? Yes?
For the clustering part of it, do you have to do a manual work to get those images together so that you find the cluster, or does it work automatically?
It's pretty much automatic. I mean, these are my math guys, who I'm not one of, and I mentioned it's a kind of big data math that comes from some Dutch guys that's being used as opposed to just a straight kind of a cluster analysis. But it works pretty well, and it's not a manual. There's not too much closing of the eyes to get it to work.